The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. This is Richard Mosley. I'm going to spend the next half an hour talking to you about employer brand positioning and differentiation. And just to give you a bit of background to start with, if you haven't come across the Employer Brand Academy yet, we have a course that runs for 8 weeks. It's a blended learning course, a combination of online webinars and in-person meetings. It provides essentially a background in the theory and practice of employer branding, and essentially is a foundational course for anybody who's either starting out in a new employer brand role or has been doing an employer brand role for a while and just really wants to get a little bit more grounding in some of the theory, some of the practice. And also, one of the great things about the course is also the ability and the opportunity to meet a wide number of other people who are also conducting similar roles in other organizations. It's a great sharing platform. The kickoff dates are essentially where people get together. You can see the list of cities here. So if you're interested in the course, then please take your pick. And then the final day is a case study sharing exercise where everybody gets to share case studies, discuss them with each other, and that leads to a final test and a final certification. So just thought I'd give you a little bit of background on that before we get going into the subject for today. And the subject of today is one part of the course, and we thought it would be useful just to give people a bit of a sneak peek, a bit of a feel for the different elements of the course as we go through the year with a number of different webinars. So brand positioning, or brand positioning and differentiation. This is one of those terms that's generally been kept within the marketing community, but increasingly, of course, as people are now using more employer brand management skills and marketing skills, and also the terminology and bringing them into recruitment marketing and employer brand management, it's become one of those interesting areas of focus. So first of all, a definition. This one I particularly like is from Kevin Lane Keller, a great and well-renowned author within the more conventional consumer brand management, corporate brand management. Wrote a fantastic book called, as you can see here, Strategic Brand Management. His definition of it, very simply, was the act of designing the company's offering and image to occupy a distinctive place in the minds of the target audience. So it's essentially really working out what you most want to be famous for as an employer brand, what you most want to be famous for as an employer, as opposed to a product and service provider or as a business. What is the thing that you most want to be famous for as an employer, and to make sure that occupies a clear and distinctive place in the mind of your target audience. I guess people would generally be more familiar with this kind of thinking in the consumer marketing space. And I think, for example, if you think about the drinks market, it's clearer generally to see the different spaces that different brands occupy. And this is important because of the two roles that a brand takes. One is essentially trust. A brand is a promise of reliable performance. But the second thing, and very important part of branding, of course, is also differentiation. Brands essentially help people make choices, and it's the same for employer brands. But this requires a degree of single-mindedness and clear positioning in people's minds. And I think you can see from these four examples how this works in the consumer space. So from a drinks point of view, Red Bull, very much about uplift, how it makes you feel, the energy it gives you. Tango, if you've not come across the product, you'll recognize from the packaging, is all about taste, that taste explosion in your mouth. Innocent is a smoothie brand, is very much about purity, no extra hidden ingredients, just the fruit and nothing but the fruit. And Coca-Cola, interestingly, and often the case with a more dominant player within the overall category, takes a broader view, a more of a, should we say, a kind of a social view on this, and its positioning is less around the product itself now and much more about how it feels. So happiness is the core positioning, and actually closely allied to that, something that's run through the Coca-Cola branding and marketing for many years, is a sense of togetherness. And if you remember back to Teach the World to Sing, and Buy the World a Coke, you'll get a sense of how deeply rooted that is in terms of Coca-Cola brand heritage. So all we're really saying here is the same is true, or at least it should be true, in the employer brand space as well. So if you're thinking about brand positioning and differentiation from an employment point of view, if you look at some of the markets or some of the industry sectors, you can actually see a fair bit of differentiation and fairly clear differentiation. I think, again, from my personal history within the space and kind of working with a number of the players in across different markets, that the fast moving consumer goods space or manufacturing consumer goods space is one of those areas where very used to branding, very used to brand management, and actually interestingly that has also reflected into their practice from an employer brand point of view. So even though this is an example that goes back now a few years, when the companies 5 or 6 years ago were first beginning to really clearly think about how they differentiated themselves from each other, rather than just simply providing a clear and compelling proposition to their target audience, you can see here how the four of the leading players in the market have gone for quite different core positionings. So here we have PepsiCo talking very much about possibilities, career possibilities, about development, really all about the potential, or realizing employees' potential. You've got Unilever, who back at, again, 5 or 6 years ago, were very much centered on purpose, and this reflected a focus within the organization which had run for many years around the social purpose of many of their activities as a business, and they drew this into the employer brand space, and their key call to action was really suggesting to people, if they joined the organization, they could make a bigger impact on the world, and many of the social causes that were important to Unilever were important to their target audience. L'Oreal, interestingly, moved from a focus very much on self-esteem, which of course aligned with their customer brand. Of course, you'll remember You're Worth It was very much the L'Oreal brand tagline for many years. They used that in the employer brand space for a while, but found that it didn't really work for them. So actually, they put much more emphasis on the performance of the organization as a business. So obviously, L'Oreal, known very much from a cosmetics point of view, sometimes seemed a bit too soft, not necessarily as business oriented from the outside as you would discover when you joined. So they decided to put a tougher edge on it to attract, actually, in their case, a much better mix of men and women to the business, for one, than they had previously, and to make sure that they pulled in some of those more difficult to reach profiles, which were the scientists, business, really hard-headed business people, to join the people who were joining much more from an interest in either cosmetics or marketing or communication. And then finally, P&G, in contrast to the other three, which in some respects are still a little bit more focused on should we say, the kind of the business of the business, P&G, with a background of being thought of as being somewhat conservative, sometimes a little bit process driven, definitely bringing in the brightest people, but not necessarily associated with a great deal of innovation and creativity, decided to focus on people. So it was the people within Procter & Gamble, summed up by this term, we hire the person, not the position, which became a core positioning them for P&G for many years. Beginning to move away from it now. In fact, all of these positionings have somewhat moved around a little, but I thought at this point in time, when 4 or 5 years ago, for the first time, these companies were really thinking about how they differentiated from each other, you can see this actually very clear differentiation and positioning amongst this group of companies. So how does this reflect more generally when you think about employer brand positioning? Well, I think actually what you see here are 4 of what we would say are the 9 classic employer brand positioning territories. And it's a bit of an arbitrary choice, I would admit, because it's not necessarily driven by big data or high-powered statistics or analysis. It's actually driven by experience. So combination of the 50 or 60 EVPs that I've worked on over the last 10 years or so, the other 50 or 60 that I was aware of or I studied with competitive analysis, combined with Universum's expertise, having also developed, well, at least 100 employee value propositions over the course of the last 7 or 8 years as well. So in combination, looking at those different value propositions, again, looking at the market, we came to a conclusion that the majority of them, a good 95%, would fall into one of these 9 positioning territories. So interesting in some respects that there's a parallel with another piece of work that's been done more recently on storytelling, and we know that storytelling is very much in vogue when it comes to employer brand communication, and rightly so. And one of the reasons that storytelling is so powerful within the employer brand context, from my point of view, is that there are a lot of parallels, and I just want to explore that in a moment. But first of all, just wanted to say a little bit more about the 7 basic plots. Basically, the theory here is that if you think of all of the books or films or plays or pieces of art that have ever been put together, they tend to also always be structured around one of 7 key narratives or structural platforms. So essentially, you can see them here: comedy, tragedy, rebirth, quest, rags to riches. You see these patterns time and time again through many of the books and films and plays that we see. Often we're not aware of them because actually there are always slightly different twists and turns and characters and contexts that play out the difference between each one. But essentially you see the same patterns. And I think the reason for that being interesting in relation to the employer brand is that I think actually if you think about the key elements that make stories engaging, there, I would like to argue they're often very much the same elements that make work engaging. And I'm going to give you a little example of, first of all, the underlying structure that you get within many stories, and then play that back into this positioning dial, as we call it, as well. So first of all, thinking about one film that I'm sure is employer brand enthusiasts that many of you have seen, The Internship. You may recall, or if you haven't seen it, it's about 2 watch salesmen, Billy and Nick, who joined the Google internship program, and it gives a real insight into the way that Google bring people into their organization. I think Google were very much involved. I think it was filmed on their campus. But what I'm interested in here is the basic underlying plot, and essentially you could summarize it as follows. So Billy and Nick have pretty contented lives as watch salesmen, but this is disrupted by this rising force, this rising power, in their case, of digital commerce, that threatens their contentment and actually puts them out of work. So they set out on a journey through this strange new world. Once they get this internship, which is their call to action, they set out through a journey through Google, through the internship program. They make new friends. They do battle with these rather strange beings that they've never come across before, these tech-savvy geniuses who work at Google. They learn over the course of time. They adapt. They put new ideas into practice. And essentially, they succeed in overwhelming or overcoming this force that had previously seemed so overwhelming. They come out on top. Now, that is a pretty solid summary of the film. But interestingly, you could say it's also pretty much the same summary and structure you would find in The Lord of the Rings. So in this case, one of the main plots, of course, there are other plots within The Lord of the Rings, but the main plot revolves around Frodo and Sam, whose contented lives in Hobbiton brought to an end by the rising power of Mordor. So not digital commerce in this case, but an even more dark and evil force. They set out on a journey through new worlds, strange new worlds. They find fellowship. You probably remember the Fellowship of the Ring. Along the way, they do battle with these other strange beings that they've never come across before, goblins and orcs. They learn, they adapt, they put new ideas to the test, and ultimately they succeed in overcoming the force that had previously appeared such an insurmountable threat. So I hope you'd agree that there are a lot of parallels, and it's not surprising. Actually, you could apply the same kind of structure to many, many other stories that you're probably familiar with. And if you stop to think of the underlying narrative and the structure of the narrative, you'll be surprised how often you see a similar pattern playing out time and time again. So how does this relate back to what I was talking about in terms of careers and positioning? Well, I think essentially the key elements that make the stories engaging, and if you think about the things I've been talking about, a higher purpose, that call to action, being part of something bigger, saving the world, forging friendships, taking on big challenges, not necessarily always goblins and orcs, but a whole range of challenges, finding solutions, finding your way through, learning from that experience, and through that learning, through moving forwards, making progress, getting new status, moving on in your career or moving on in the story, ultimately achieving goals, becoming better at performing what you do, whether it's wielding a sword in Lord of the Rings for the hobbits, or wielding a pen, or shall we say an Excel spreadsheet when it comes to business, and ultimately achieving status and reward. So of course in the classic fairy tale, the status and reward would be untold riches and marrying the princess or marrying the prince, depending on which way you lean. But essentially it's a similar structure in terms of how people will often think about the careers that they have, either within an individual employer or over the course of their lives. So I would argue that when you come back to these brand positioning territories, you have pretty much the same key ingredients. And I don't think this is too far-fetched. We didn't actually start with the story structure and then work it into the positioning territories. It's just something that we've noticed that there appear to be quite a few parallels between. And so moving on, these tend to be core positioning territories, and we see them time and time again. I would just suggest that it's useful for you when you're looking at your core competitors to bear in mind where they are positioned in relation to this wheel, and it gives you a framework in some respects to provide a bit more of a structured analysis of where they are and where you could potentially position yourselves. So just to give you a bit of flavor around this, classically, for example, if you're looking at purpose, this is generally about the wider purpose of the organization, of course, and your role within it. So I'm also going to give a bit of a commentary on which industries tend to go for which positioning areas. And one industry that, of course, tends to be very vocational and tends to emphasize purpose is the pharmaceutical industry. And this is a classic example here from Eli Lilly, or Lilly Careers here, and the main emphasis here, improving lives around the world. And essentially it's about joining this crusade. It's about joining this larger purpose. And this is a pretty classic example of that purpose positioning. Second one around teamwork. And it's interesting how many of the startups that have become bigger, in this case Airbnb, have tended to put a great emphasis on togetherness. And this is the teamwork element, the people first element. You tend to get visually lots of pictures of people hanging out pretty much looking like they're still at university, I would have to say, although it's a pretty nice university, depending on where you went. And I guess the positioning here is one to say that, you don't have to give up on that sense of togetherness and friendship once you join an organization. In fact, there are certain organizations where you join where that sense of togetherness will be even greater than you probably had when you were at university or prior to that. And it's the main feature of the organization, that sense of sometimes shared purpose, but shared culture, a shared sense of doing things together is very much at the heart of the business. Number three, and it's interesting, again, if you look around at some of the, should we say, more grown-up tech players, such as Microsoft, such as Apple and so on, they tend to be a little bit less focused on the togetherness and a little bit more focused on empowerment. This is one of those other areas where you tend to get tech-focused businesses focusing on how you can either through the technology or through the business as an employer, not only help to empower others, and in some respects, if you take the broader view on this, empower the future of the world, but also feel empowered within the business to achieve great things. And again, Microsoft here, Empower Your Future, is a very classic example of that. Close to that is innovation. Get others, again, pretty often in the tech sector and very predominantly, should we say, in the engineering sector. So here we're looking at Chevron, which is one side of engineering. Obviously, in this case, they're looking at engineers in the petrochemical sector. But a very common positioning within this area is a focus on big, complex challenges and big, complex projects. You can see here that they're specifically saying that they take on some of the biggest challenges in the world, and that's a great call to action for anybody interested in big challenges and big solutions. And then a couple more just to finish off. We're not doing everyone around the outside, but another very common one is the career positioning. This tends to be, in some respects, the most generic of the positionings, because of course everybody's looking for a career of some kind, or at least most people are looking for a career of some kind when they're joining an organization. Excuse my coughing. And one of the classic ways of talking about this, as you see here, is particularly with global companies, is talking about the range and scope of opportunities, or the world of opportunities, particularly if you're in a multinational company. Finally, performance. You get this also in a number of businesses, and of course you would expect to find it in one that was so devoted to sport as ESPN, and with the great core positioning, partly togetherness, but actually ultimately about performance. Together we triumph. So pushing boundaries across every media platform, 24/7, 365 days of the year. Absolutely no question that this is a performance-driven company. So that gives you just a bit of a flavour going around the outside. These are all kind of archetypal examples of some of these key positionings. But what I'd also like to point out, that it's important to point out, that around some of these archetypes, and typically within different areas of business, you tend to get quite generic positionings. So not only are they companies choosing the territory, so for example, in this case, purpose within the pharma industry, but very often they tend to choose almost exactly the same positioning within that broader area of purpose. So if you remember back to Lilly Careers, they're very much about improving lives around the world. Well, let me just show you three others from the same pharma sector. So we have Roche, make your mark, improving lives or improve lives. We have Merck, we are committed to saving and improving lives. And we have Novartis, whose core purpose is essentially to extend and improve lives. So slight variations, but you can see that the major use of the language and the main thrust of this is actually occupying a very similar space around improving lives, making life better. Now, of course, it's what they do within the pharma industry, but the point is that what you're trying to do with positioning is find your own positioning within the territory. So within the territory of purpose, how you talk about purpose, you've got to find a way, generally speaking, from a brand perspective, to get across what makes your approach to this particular thing distinctive rather than just simply describing the main thrust of what you're doing. Give you another example, and this is for those who've seen one of my other presentations, which is standing out for the crowd. You'll recognize this, which is the Welcome to a World of Opportunities. Again, it has been over the course of the last few years now, and I apologize to nearly all of the companies involved in this, because I know that UBS, Bank of America, Citibank, and HSBC are all now using different lines. But I'm just making the point that over the course of time, over the course of the last 3 to 5 years, that this line tends to be somewhat of a default within financial services, because I've seen it pretty much every one of the banks at some point during that 4 or 5 years using it on their main career page. So it's not saying that there's anything wrong with the line. Again, it's just making people a little bit more aware that there are some defaults, some kind of easy lines, some easy positionings, or some positionings that are dead center for the territory you're trying to occupy, that seem like a good fit to begin with, because it's good, simple, direct language, but may not necessarily be the ideal solution because it ends up being the same as everyone else. So visually as well, and again, this is an extended version of something I shared in a previous presentation around standing out from the crowd. And this was my rule of 4. And I think I showed 4 examples before. Well, I've actually thrown in a few new examples this time around. And again, apologies to some of those companies involved, or in fact all of the companies involved, but definitely to some of them, because they've moved on from these images. But over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, it's just showing how typically companies will default to a very similar setting. So here, in terms of presenting diversity from global banks, time and time again, it's come back to the rule of 4. 2 men, 2 women, a range of different ethnic backgrounds, as you can see, but it's just making the point that this may be an obvious default. It may get the message across, but very often you've got to think beyond it to make sure that you differentiate from your competitors. So what are the lessons here? Well, or at least what are the recommendations? First one is map your competition. I've shown you some things that are visual, and that's important, but actually you can also use research, whether Universum research. We're just about to publish some best practice benchmarks, which include areas of positioning for some of the major industry sectors. This one gives a view of the range of typical positionings overall. This is from 1,000 employers worldwide, and it also breaks it into some of the other more specific attributes we use, which provide a little bit more granularity, shall we say, around some of the areas of positioning you could choose. Shows that teamwork and innovation are the most popular positioning areas at the moment, if you look at all employers across the world, followed by purpose and status. Interestingly, career and learning rather less so, although professional training and development as a very specific item is probably the most commonly used area in terms of a pillar. In terms of overall positioning, interestingly, it tends to be purpose, innovation, teamwork that tends to dominate, rather than some of these other areas around learning, empowerment, and performance, and so on. So just interesting. This will vary from industry to industry. I think I gave you a bit of a flavor as we went round the outside of the positioning wheel, where some sectors like pharma or like engineering or some of the new tech sectors tend to position themselves, but you can do this analysis to get some idea of where there may be an opportunity for you to stand out from the crowd. Second one is basically how you find your own space or your own narrative within the positioning territory. So it may be that you're choosing innovation, but you don't necessarily have to follow the crowd. So as I was saying, if you're in the big innovation territory of engineering firms, nearly all of them tend to talk about taking on big challenges, and they're using very similar language. What I'm suggesting here is that whatever territory you're in, you've got to try and switch a little bit from the what you're doing to the how you're doing it, and find your own language and your own way of describing it that fits with your culture. And there are some good examples here from Facebook's moving fast and breaking things, which is their very interesting and, of course, very successful approach to innovating through trying things out and sticking with what works, through to IKEA's democratic design, which is a great deal of creativity, a great deal of innovation, but on a budget and with a very practical bent. So you get a sense from this how these companies have chosen a territory, but very much found their own unique positioning within it. And finally, coming back to the great rule of four, you don't need the rule of four. You can find other ways of getting across the point about diversity rather than just showing a group of four diverse people. I particularly like, again, coming back to Deutsche Bank, the fact that Deutsche Bank, which I think also reflects the fact that they are thinking with agile minds, choose to show the diversity within their business in a much more expressive, metaphorical sense. And I loved this. They've actually moved it on now, but I love the fact that for a bank, they've shown the richness and diversity of the organization internally through a collection of rather colourful, and I would have to say well-used, paint pots. Not what you would expect from a German bank. Very disruptive, and I would say a great advert for the agile thinking, certainly from the communication employer brand team's point of view. And I would hope to say that on the inside as well, that Deutsche Bank would be a lot more diverse and a lot more colourful and expressive than you might at first expect from the outside. So that's all from me today. I hope that's been of interest to you. As I say, please check out the Employer Brand Academy site if you're interested in some of the courses that we're running, particularly that Employer Brand Fundamental Guide to Employer Brand course that's coming up in April. Please take a look, and it'd be great to see you on one of those courses, as I will be actively involved in a number of them. But thank you again. That's all for today, and please check in when we hold a number of these seminars and webinars going forwards, because it would be lovely to speak with you again.